Good evening and welcome to Crowd Healing, a public educational program brought to you by the We Heal Foundation and KIYS Radio. Tonight we will discuss the prevalence of chronic pain, the resulting epidemic in addiction to opiates, and the urgent need for a healthier, more natural alternative to these opiate drugs. Chronic pain is described as anything lasting 3 months or longer, and it is in epidemic proportions. The CDC reports that at least 50 million Americans suffer from some sort of chronic pain, and other studies report the numbers as high as 100,000 Americans, or roughly 1 in 3, suffer from some form of chronic pain. The annual medical cost of chronic pain in the United States is estimated in the billions. Traditional pain management has been centered on medications with heavy amounts of opioids prescribed. The approach has proven very ineffective. As the patient's tolerance grows, they need higher and higher doses and with less and less effect, and eventually become unable to function in daily life. Recently, more progressive pain programs focus on functional restoration, physical therapy, and other modalities, but still the dependence on opiates continues to be very high. Joining me tonight, please welcome Matt Cummings, founder of Med1Rx, a clinical pharmacist who graduated from the University of California, San Francisco, and has conducted cancer research with the National Institute of Health and Clinical Science at UCSF. Also, welcome Fadi Asfoor, a doctor of pharmacy and is a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Pacific School of Pharmacy. Also joining us tonight, please welcome Abit Singh, Chief Medical Officer of multiple biotech companies and a member of the board of directors for the We Heal Foundation. Thank you all for joining me tonight.
Thanks, Eric.
So, just to start off on this, how did you guys, coming from a pharmaceutical background, not necessarily in pain management or anything else, focus in on this key need in our current society?
Yeah. So, Matt and I, both graduates, started practicing pharmacy, and what happened was we started seeing patients with the same problems, which was they had addicted to opiates, and from there they wanted other modalities. So some of these patients began to go to dispensaries and asking about marijuana or cannabis, as we like to use the word and term. And what we found out very, very, very fast is that there was a disconnect between the medical community and these patients. So they would go to these dispensaries, they would purchase products, they would come back to the physician. The physician wouldn't know what was going on with the patient from the outcome side, safety. And then we also saw the issue with the stigma of cannabis in society, and so we saw ourselves in the middle between that and hopefully bridging the gap. So that's where we kind of launched Med1 into where it is today, which is being the middle between providing transparency and outcomes for physicians and patients and caregivers.
Fadi, you both being doctors of clinical pharmacy and having that background, how did you come into working with patients with chronic pain and then of course working with them in different combinations of cannabis?
Yeah, it's a good question. So after we completed our education, we served the community, and what became apparent to us is that patients were addicted to opiates and they needed alternatives, and we saw kind of a shift of patients asking about cannabis, and they would go to dispensaries and come back with products that were not tested or not clinically validated. So we took this as there was a problem, and there was a disconnect with physicians about this information. And so we launched Med1 to take a scientific approach to cannabis dosing and collecting clinical outcomes or data to validate these patients' quality of life and function and their goals. So that's kind of how Med1 took off. And that's where we are today. Great.
So you sort of fell into this. I mean, it was really, you saw a need and you started helping patients, and the next thing you know, you see yourself, in a sense, prescribing or working with their physicians to prescribe cannabis. in a scientific step-by-step process that they can document the results in a sense. So that's what's really been missing, really, hasn't it? I mean, people are just sort of shooting from the hip and going out and buying stuff at dispensaries, but they really don't. There's no process or step-by-step scientific process to figure out how to do this. For especially a patient who doesn't normally use cannabis and doesn't know how it affects them and everything else. So tell me, how do you guys, how many patients have you worked with so far, and what has the results have been? And Matt, maybe you can tell us, what would be the first step? Like, for me, after all my cancer treatment, I suffered a lot of serious chronic pain, and obviously for a long time was on very heavy opiate drugs, but obviously it's not a sustainable way to manage your pain. So
yeah, no, these are great questions. So in our clinic or in our practice, we've seen about 1,500 to 2,000 patients, and there is sufficient evidence, not just from our experience, but also in the literature, that really supports, a bunch of different conditions. Chronic pain is kind of the one that we've been tackling because, as you mentioned, it's so prolific throughout our society, and we see as pharmacists a huge way to impact the community in offering, especially patients who are in chronic pain,
Sure.
an alternative to opiate therapy, which not only the patients are now asking for, but we're trying to work on a societal level as well, public
Sure.
health level, to prevent more opiates from getting out in the community. And to address your second question, how would you become, as a patient, how would you find more resources on this type of thing? Part of our what our mission is to provide more education to patients and to really get the right information out there. But it's not just for patients, it's also for other people in healthcare, physicians, helping them manage these patients, and also for people who have caregivers as well, to
Absolutely.
help them through the process of someone who's in chronic pain.
So a caregiver that's administering the medications for a patient and working with that patient on a daily basis, you would educate them on, how to work with that patient to figure out what dose is good for them and, all that sort of thing. So, Fadi, tell me, just before we move on, a little bit about that. So a lot of people are like, come on, I'm just not going to smoke marijuana, and smoking's not good for you in the first place and everything else. So somebody that wants to try and see if cannabis is something that they can use to manage their chronic pain or inflammatory issues and things like that, how do they? What do you recommend? What is the form that they take it in, and how do they start off doing this without being afraid of getting too high, or having it affect their mental capacity and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So the evidence stepwise approach we take is really we collect information about the patient in respect to their medical history, their background, and the drugs they're on. And as pharmacists, we're trained to really look at that information and augment any physician medication history or any type of medications the patient does not need to be on. But we take an approach where we look at the disease, we look at the condition, the medications they're on, and then we pick the right route that the patient should utilize cannabis. And so it could be an oral product, or it could be a sublingual under the tongue, a topical, or an inhalation. And then after that, we basically start them on a ratio and a dose and a frequency. And it's all kind of stepwise based off of their tolerance and their previous cannabis use history. And so it's very scientific of how we approach each patient, personalized wise.
Great. So, Matt, when he's talking about an oral product or an under the tongue, what does that mean? I mean, what does that mean to the average person who doesn't know about that? So, is it is it a pill that you put under your tongue, or is it how does that? What form does that take?
So, as pharmacists, we're really trained on how to get drugs into the body, and the best way to do that to minimize side effects and maximize the therapeutic effects of whatever compound we're giving. And in this case, with cannabis, there are many ways that we can get the drug into the body, as Fadi mentioned. But the one that we have found to be the most effective therapeutically with the least amount of side effects is the sublingual product. And for various reasons, it absorbs better. There's not as much variability in how much drug gets into the system. And the liver has, a part to play in some oral products that might increase side effects for patients. And so we prefer the sublingual products to obviously inhalation and the orals, and occasionally topicals.
Okay,
can work
so
for
I'm
specific
still a little
conditions.
bit confused. Sublingual, oral, is this like an oil that I put on my tongue, or a pill, or what form does it take? And
Sure. So to use the sublingual delivery method, it's a liquid.
it's a liquid. Okay.
Yeah, and we use very controlled doses that you can put under your tongue, and that's what we have found to be the most effective for therapeutic use of cannabis.
So it's like what, an eyedropper, or it's a liquid. So you pour it under there, or what do you do?
So to dose it accurately, we use a dropper, but it's an oral syringe actually, and so you can measure exactly the volume that you're getting.
Oh, okay. Now I
And-
get it. I
Yes.
understand. All right.
So you draw it
makes
up
sense.
just like you would any other syringe, and it's graduated. There's little markers on the side.
You take a little syringe, you pull out a certain dose that you're prescribed, and then you just stick it in your mouth like
Yes.
that. Okay,
Yep.
so
Yeah.
very simple. No smoking, no
Totally.
all those carcinogenic side effects and all that stuff. Okay, great. So, I know, obviously I've networked a lot with physicians, and I'm sure Dr. Singh can comment on this, but I know that from talking to them that they want to do this. Their patients are asking them about this. Chronic pain patients are saying, "Hey, is this for me?" And the doctor's like, "Yeah, well, I mean, the feedback is good, the science looks good, and everything else, but I just don't know, how to take the first step. I mean, you can go try it yourself, and I can try to walk you through it, but there really lacks the process. And so what you guys are bringing to the table is very, very important. Dr. Singh, do you have a comment for us about what kind of this really is almost a service for the physicians who are lacking a means of administering this new, potentially very helpful drug or treatment for chronic pain and other issues, mainly chronic pain, for what we're discussing tonight.
So that was a great question, Eric. I've talked to a lot of my peers in the physician community, and there's tremendous excitement about potentially using cannabis as chronic pain management. The major stumbling block, and these two, Matt and Fadi, will attest to this, is that the FDA has not mandated or allowed the use of cannabis for a majority of conditions for which they could potentially be very efficacious. I think, to my mind, there are only two approved conditions right now, which is for epilepsy, which Epidiolex is approved, and then for cancer therapy for patients getting tremendous nausea. So there are two molecules which the FDA has approved for nausea during cancer therapy, chemotherapy only. But barring that, there is no other approved indication. So that means the physicians can't legitimately use cannabis, let alone get reimbursed for it. Listen, I think there was a seminal article in the 2016 edition of the Journal of Pain Management. We talked about, we did a double-blind, randomized controlled study, placebo-controlled, and talked about how for folks who were taking cannabis, there was a 64% reduction in the opiate use for cancer patients.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Which is an amazing stat. It was 64, which means that there are 64% people less likely to get addicted and hooked onto opioids, and 64% reduction in the epidemic, which you were alluding to earlier, Eric, at the start of the segment. Not only that, there was a 70% reduction in pain in those cancer folks, which is personally very exciting for me as a
Absolutely.
and seeing cancer patients. So it's not that the data is not out there. Well, this was one study. I guess it comes down to the point where critical mass of studies kind of forces the hand of the FDA to kind of look more seriously into approving these for a plethora more conditions.
For standard of care use, yeah.
Epidiolex and these two molecules was July 2018, so just barely less than 6 months ago. Mm-hmm. So I am very optimistic that in 2019, just by virtue of private pharma companies approaching the FDA, they might put a lot of pressure to green light and fast track.
Thank you. No, thank you very much. So really, you brought up a very good point, doctor, and that is that, you have acute pain, which is, obviously, going through chemotherapy or having a major surgery or something like that. And opiates, have proven somewhat effective for acute pain management, but, again, not very effective for chronic pain management. So if those, and as we said earlier, chronic pain is defined as pain that lasts for 3 months or longer. And so, really, we're talking about two things. One, using cannabis, and correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, but one, helping patients who are currently on pain management drugs, opiates, decrease their amount of intake of those drugs and potentially even get off them altogether. And then two, using cannabis potentially on the onset of chronic pain or even during the acute process when the pain is new to prevent them getting on the opiates in the first place. So, are those both, a situation that you address with Med1? Fadi, you want to answer that?
Yeah. So, what we're finding is that post-surgery, there's a opportunity there. There is a opportunity in chronic pain, in neuropathic pain, right? There is also the non-neuropathic pain. There are a lot of different, cancer pain, palliative care. Mm-hmm. There's a whole bunch of areas that opiates are being used. But I think, just to, kind of go back to the FDA thing, the DEA really is the one who's holding, everything back, which is really the molecule of THC. And what we find is that THC is crucial to pain modulation with CBD. And so that's something that we found through our patient population and the outcomes we've seen just kind of support that from our side. But the reality is that, the FDA and the DEA will do their thing. I think it's becoming more of a state thing. And so like the California Medical Association has released their own guidelines to help physicians recommend cannabis appropriately to patients without kind of the risk of being, their license being at risk. So, we're taking an approach that is really, looking at how the physician world is looking at this, but also looking at it from state to state. And California seems to be one of the leaders in this side. So.
Excellent. So again, it's almost like this is a service for physicians that they can direct their patients to, manage the process, indirectly, and then you guys facilitate everything.
Yes.
So that's fantastic. So you both, obviously you work with the patients, you get their histories and everything else. You prescribe, and you follow, and you follow the patients along and feed all that information back to the doctor. Yes. So, Matt, what's a way if somebody wanted to do this, and what would a way that they could approach this? First, obviously, and I like this that you mentioned that the patients that you work with, you're working with on recommendations from their physicians, and you're working with their physicians on this process. So that's a completely different model than what most people have done, like we said, shooting from the hip and walking into a dispensary and just buying whatever. So, Matt, tell us a little bit about the process and what a patient needs to do if they're interested in looking into this.
Sure. Yeah. So ultimately, healthcare decisions are driven by the patient. And so we want the patient to be as involved in their care as both the physician and the pharmacist. And so if you are a patient and you're, have a condition that you think cannabis would benefit you, I think the first place to start is in your physician's office. You want to bring up the topic and discuss with your physician if that's an appropriate treatment for you. And and then the handoff is really when the physician decides that it is an appropriate treatment. That's when we come in and aid the physician in decision making around dosing, product selection, frequency, and that sort of thing. And ultimately, we will help educate you as a patient or possibly your caregiver on what to expect, how to use the medication appropriately, any side effects that we want to watch out for, and we'll guide you through that whole process as a patient from the pharmacist perspective. And then we will also close the loop with your physician by making sure that your physician knows where in the process you are, and really making sure that the whole medical care team is involved in the information that we are providing you.
Absolutely. I mean, okay, so I got a couple questions. Everything you say is so interesting. And so what if your physician, I'm a patient, I go to my doctor and I say, hey, I really don't want to be on these drugs, or I don't like the way they're making me feel. But if I try to stop them, I'm just in too much pain to get through the day. What if the doctor says, I don't know. I don't know if this is something that, you could go ahead and try it or whatever, but, that's not what people need. People need a scientific approach to this, and obviously the physicians also want that as well. So if a patient runs into that situation where their physician just says, I don't know, is there a way that a patient could facilitate a conversation with you and their doctors that the physician could then, know that this is, that they're really, that they're in the driver's seat here, that, obviously if you're going to be reducing medications they're on systematically in some way, you need to be coordinating that with their physicians, because the prescriptions are going to change and the doses are going to change. So how would a patient do that? How would they just contact you guys and say, hey, would you be willing to talk to my doctor about this? What you tell us what to do.
It's a good question, and it is a complicated one, because as pharmacists, we would never want to step in between a patient-physician relationship. I think that's a unique bond, and we're not there to undercut the physician's decision-making whatsoever. However, we as pharmacists are also important in providing the physician with the right information around drug use and prescribing to make sure that the physician has all the right information to make that prescribing decision. And so we're more than happy to have any discussions that need to be had around efficacy or safety with cannabis with any physician that is interested. We have both anecdotal evidence from our own clinical practice in treating patients with cannabis, and there is a ton of research out there, maybe not in the United States, but in other first world countries around cannabis use. These are very robust studies, and we're happy to review those with the physician as well.
Okay. So for physicians, a couple points, if there's any physicians out there watching, it's not the physician prescribing the actual or delivering the actual medication. You guys take care of that. You're just sort of working with the physician on the package, saying, we'll get the patient, and start adjusting their levels of different things, find the optimal dosing and everything else for that patient, and then you can work with that patient in tandem to lower the other medications and things like that. That's essentially how it works? Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay, great. So tell us a little bit more about, what you see as, what makes you different, from what's already out there. I mean, obviously we talked about, a scientific, step-by-step approach to this, that you work with physicians. But from a patient perspective, what makes this so attractive to patients? And can patients come to you without the recommendation of a physician?
Totally.
What if their physicians, they don't feel comfortable going and talking to their doctor about it, but they want to try it on their own?
Yeah. So, the behind Med1, the goal is really to make it easy, simple, and safe for patients to try cannabis therapies under the supervision of a licensed pharmacist or healthcare provider. And so, the idea behind having a patient come to us first. We do have a hotline that they can talk to a pharmacist. We also provide an email where they can kind of get in contact with us, and we can kind of reroute them to a physician that is involved in pain management and looks at cannabis as an option for for patients. So we're kind of in this way where patients come to us. We're kind of a navigator for these patients, but at the same time, physicians, we would like to work more with physicians on this because of the cross team care team information exchange that is more valuable to the outcome of the patient in a positive way. And so, part of our program with patients is really identifying a treatment plan and sticking with that plan and those goals, and making having the patient accountable, and in the whole process, because we want to meet these goals and make sure that the physicians are both involved at every level, as we go forward.
So in short, you prefer to work with physicians, but I wasn't really clear. Do you work with patients without their physicians? And would you do that? So if a patient called your hotline, and we'll make sure that you as a patient has that number to call before the end of the segment here. But could I call as a patient and just say, hey, look, this is my issue, and can you guys walk me through doing this, in a scientific way? So
yeah, so we do have a place for patients to call us, but our goal is to reroute them to a physician, so the physician is actually providing a recommendation.
Okay.
So
if a patient doesn't have a physician that they work with or that they feel comfortable working with regard to this, you would facilitate that.
Yes.
So really, either way, it's either with an existing physician or a physician that you arrange. That you want to have a medical doctor involved in this care.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Good to know. Dr. Singh, do you have any other questions for them? I mean, this is an amazing, new frontier here, because, everyone's talking about it. Everybody, there's proof that it works. It can be an amazing, natural, potentially organic treatment and medication. And, it's time that we embrace this as a society in a scientific way. So as a physician, what do you want to see happen, or what questions do you want to ask the pharmacists here from Med1 about their treatment plan?
I think Matt and Fadi did a great job explaining the symbiotic, synergetic relationship with physicians, which Med1 kind of facilitates. So I'm pretty optimistic they'll gain traction and acquire a captive audience of patients who will then anecdotally have other folks kind of come on to you guys and get cannabis legitimately, and you guys will counsel them about the appropriate way, but also the therapeutically the best way to take it for their specific pathology. But Eric, I don't want to clear like a misconception about cannabis at this point, right?
Sure.
Like not a lot of people, I don't think it's widely known, but there are natural cannabinoid receptors in a human brain. Okay. It's not like a drug or a chemical you're taking. Body produces trace amounts of cannabis already, which then hook onto these organic receptors already present in the brain. And what you're doing is just providing a agonist in a sense by giving cannabis
a boost
as a pill or under the tongue. And so in a way, you're kind of, in a sense, you're destined to take cannabis.
And naturally like, within your own body. Yes.
Yeah.
It occurs naturally within your own body.
So you're just kind of helping that process along. Let's face it, if you're healthy in prime condition, you probably don't need cannabis external. But God forbid, if you had cancer and are undergoing chemo, have terrible, intractable pain. I know that, Eric, you are a cancer survivor. It's
Yes.
been awesome. You had chemical arachnoiditis, terrible pain most days, but you did not want to get hooked onto opioids because you had tremendous willpower, okay? But not a lot of people, unfortunately, can muster the willpower when they are under that amount of pain to kind of stay away or wean away from opioids. That
Well,
is
it wasn't
very-
always. I mean, for years there wasn't any other option for me. So for years, I had to take, in order to even get out of bed every day and function, I needed high doses of opioid medication. More recently, doctors, became more aware of much healthier options. And there's much healthier medications out there and everything else. Obviously, lifestyle choices and anti-inflammatories and so there's some powerful NSAIDs. But of course, all those drugs, are pharmaceuticals. They're not natural. They do have side effects. This is something that interests me greatly from a personal perspective, in the sense that if this can manage my pain without taking, pharmaceutical drugs that do cause side effects, then it's something I definitely would want to look at. And I'm sure most patients feel the same way as I do.
And the history of the U.S. shows us that the Native Americans used to actually take cannabis every day for a host of conditions, right? And at some point, the U.S. kind of federal government put in place a law, which was around the inception of pharma as we know it, and pharma companies. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting how many agendas were at play there.
Always there are, yes.
The biggest reason why cannabis did not catch on recently is because big pharma, till recently, did not know how to monetize a plant, right? But now it's heartening to see that pharma companies are trying to dissect the plant and trying to apply for patents, which, for good or for worse, big pharma is monetized deeply, and so can provide the funding resources to have cannabis-based pills out there and help patients legitimately. I am a personal fan of the entourage effect, and Matt and Fadi will attest to that, in that some portions of the plant do not have as much effect as the whole plant together, which is the entourage effect.
Yes.
So I'm hoping that a pharma company might kind of look into that and research into that, to have that for patient populations.
Well, that's kind of what Med1 is doing.
By these guys.
I think that's kind of what Med1 is doing. So, but before we close, I want to address that really quick, because I know that personally I've been confused about that. People talk about the anti-inflammatory effects of CBD oil and pure CBD oil. Oh, I don't want any drug. I just want the oil. And this magic oil. But the reality is that CBD oil all by itself, without these entourage of other cannabinoids or other chemical effects, or I should say, I forget the word I'm looking for. Terpenes, exactly. So the different terpenes that are in the cannabis plant, it simply just doesn't work. They don't work in unison by themselves. It's the combination that naturally occurs within this plant that magically does, have the positive effects that we're looking for. So it's about, but at the same time, I don't want to walk around mentally impaired all the time and not be able to function or work or anything else. So, how do you guys address that? Where do you start with a beginning dose with a patient? And, what sort of percentages are you looking at? And then, how do you sort of manage all those different entourage of terpenes that obviously the different combinations are going to affect people in different ways? So
that's a great question, and I think we just blasted through a lot of I think content that might be confusing for some people. Mm-hmm. And Dr. Singh brought up the entourage effect, which is something that the hemp CBD market has kind of taken advantage of in marketing the CBD aspect of the hemp plant, which is just CBD. And albeit it's the same CBD that's in cannabis, but the unique differences between cannabis and hemp is that cannabis has a full spectrum of hundreds of chemicals and compounds that are related to THC and CBD that work synergistically to help the patient or help the user deal with whatever condition they're dealing with. And so, so one thing I think is dispelling any sort of misconceptions out there between hemp-derived CBD and cannabis-derived CBD and THC. And just to recover that, the entourage effect is really what provides the efficacy from cannabis that a lot of people don't find, or find in maybe really high doses of taking the hemp-derived CBD. So I think, a lot of what we try to do, Fadi and I, is education around the different products out there, and especially trying to help people understand that the hemp-derived CBD, while you may experience some anti-inflammation or anti-inflammatory effects,
like an omega-3 oil, basically.
Yeah, we really try to use cannabis therapeutically as the medicine that that has the full effect of the pain reduction, the anti-inflammatory, the combination of the THC, the CBD, and the other compounds like terpenes, which are somewhat therapeutically active, although there's more and more research coming out about those compounds, but that remains to be seen.
As nature intended, right?
Yeah. But I'll let Fadi address how we kind of guide patients through the dosing strategy, because I think it is important for people to understand that as pharmacists, your safety is number one, and it's a priority for us.
We're just about out of time, but please, Fadi, if you could just tell us quickly what how you initiate a patient into the program, and how you manage those different levels of CBD to THC and all that.
Totally. So, the patient journey really is, the patient would come to us, and, we'll collect all this information about you just to kind of know your background. And the reality is it's really the THC that we're looking for that could cause some of the side effects. And so we start the patient on a ratio of CBD to THC with, kind of the terpene profile that we see efficacious or effective. And then from there, we kind of follow up with you the next 2 weeks of calling you and texting you and emailing you to figure out how you're feeling, to figure out what the ratio is right for you. So every patient is different. They have, different sensitivities. But that's how we kind of go about it, is really titrating the THC and the ratios with the CBD.
It's a very hands-on, very customized, individual process. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you all being here. This is very informational and educational. Thank you for joining us here on Crowd Healing. You have a wonderful evening, and please look forward to our next segments.